In this video, I'll show how to set up your Google Calendar and Notion integration using Automate.io in a way that makes it synchronize both ways. Two-way synchronization means that when you create or update an event in Google Calendar, it will be automatically synchronized in Notion and vice versa from Notion to Google Calendar. For this one, you don't need to use any coding tools. This solution will work for you nicely if you're using both Notion and Google Calendar for managing your tasks and events. What makes it exceptionally great is that it works both for adding and editing events. For this setup, you'll need three things: Notion task database, your Google Calendar account, and Automate.io account with personal plan or trial. This is needed to create multi-step bots. In order for it to work in Notion, you'll need to have two extra properties to your task database. The first property is date, which is going to be used both as start date and time and end date and time for Google events. And the second property is Google Calendar ID, which will be used to store ID of the event. The main reason why I'm using Automate.io and not Zapier is simply because on Zapier you don't have enough tools to make it work. You don't have the necessary trigger for Notion integration for editing database. So in order to make it work, you'll need to have 4 Automate.io bots. One for adding Google Calendar events, one for updating Google Calendar events, and same for Notion, adding database item and updating database item in Notion. One small note before trying to set up the bots: make sure that Automate.io has access to your Notion database. The trick to achieving synchronicity is to establish a relation between two entities: Google Calendar event and Notion database record. We need to somehow link our events in both Google Calendar and Notion so that they know about each other and stay in sync. For this purpose, we will use Google Calendar event ID property for our first bot. So the first trigger we want to implement is when we add an event to Google Calendar, so it automatically adds to Notion. The trigger is called event added. You can also use another trigger option called event start. It will automatically add all the events within the specified time range, but for the simplicity of demo we will use a single event. Here you'll need to select the Google Calendar account. For now it only works with one Google Calendar account, but it's possible to make it work with multiple ones. I can share it in another video later on. So the action that we need is to add Notion record for the Google Calendar event that we created. For this one you'll need to link your Notion workspace if you haven't done this already, and select your database. So what we want to achieve at this step is to link both Google Calendar and Notion. We are going to do this by taking the event ID from Google Calendar and putting it into the Notion property Google Calendar ID. Next we want to choose the event start date and end date and put the event summary in the task name. So here we linked our Notion record to Google Calendar event. However, Google Calendar event still is not linked to Notion, so it doesn't know that Notion exists. In order to sync them both ways, we need to add another step. We will use a simple trick. We will update a created event with Notion page ID and put it inside the description of Google Calendar event. Essentially the only place where we can put the page ID is either description or the summary, which is event name, but event name will be busy with our task name, so the description is the remaining place. And lastly, we want to add all the fields to this action so that they stay in sync for example, the start time and end time. We want to put them over here, and of course we want to use this event ID to make sure we add these properties and details into the needed event. Alright, now the bot is complete. We're gonna Now we forgot to select the calendar. We're gonna click save, turn it on, go to Google Calendar and try to create test event. Now we can press I'm done and look at our Notion database. Here we can see that task from Google Calendar was added to Notion, and it has the Google Calendar event ID in the property. And if we go back to the Google Calendar, we can see that now the Google Calendar event has the Notion ID of the task in its description. Do you see what we did here? Essentially, we linked Google Calendar event and Notion database record together. This is the fundamental step in this integration. The key is to establish a relation between Google Calendar and Notion two ways, from Google Calendar to Notion and from Notion to Google Calendar. Once we have both entities linked to each other, everything becomes much easier. The next thing we want to do is to create a bot that will update our Notion record every time the Google Calendar event is updated. For it, we need to create a new bot with event modified trigger. Again, we need to select our calendar. In order to update our task in Notion, we need to find it first. So the next step is to search for our Notion record in our Notion database. We could try to skip this step and update the database item using the title or the event summary. However, this won't work if you have two Google Calendar events with the same title, so I wouldn't recommend that. So we'll use search item by property, and we need to select our database. So this action allows us to use this search property, Google Calendar ID, event ID, and to search our Notion database for items with this ID. Once we found this Notion record, only then we can update it. So now we can choose an action to update the database item, and for this one we'll need to select the custom value and put the page ID of the record that we found in the previous step. Next, what we want to do is to update the start date and the end date with the event begins and event ends from the Google Calendar events. And just in case the event name was changed, we also want to update it there. Now we can save and turn on this bot. Let's try to test it. I'll move this event to Friday, let's say. Here we can press I'm done. Here we can see that the event moved from Thursday to Friday, and it still is linked to our Google Calendar ID, and also our Google Calendar remains linked. Now we'll begin with Notion to Google Calendar bots that will help us to complete the integration. The setup is actually a bit trickier than it may seem from the beginning, so stay with me. For the simplicity, I called our bots bot number 1 for the Google Calendar added event and bot number 2 for Google Calendar event updated. Now we want to create a bot number 3 for when the new database item is created in Notion. What we want to do is we want to create a Google Calendar event each time we add a new database item to our Notion. Here we need to select our database. The next step is to add a Google Calendar event. So here we need to select the Google Calendar as well. We want to use the task name for a summary, start date, and the end date for the start time and end time. So this is one of the advantages of Automate.io over Zapier, is that you can use the same field of date for both start date and time and end date and time for Notion. On Zapier you would have to create a second property in Notion for end time. And again, we're putting the page ID into the description of Google Calendar event to establish a relation between Google event and Notion record. Now if we leave it here, Google Calendar events will be added to Google Calendar from Notion records, but the Notion records will not know about the Google Calendar events. So we'll need to add an extra step where we link our Notion record to Google Calendar event. For this one we'll use update database item action, select our database, use custom value, and we want to use the same page ID as from the first step. Then we want to set up the Google Calendar ID to be the same as event ID in newly created event. So we will take the event ID from this property over here. Now all our newly created Notion records will be linked with Google Calendar events. It looks like we're done here, but there is actually one more important aspect. If we leave it like this bot will create a Google Calendar event. And here where the things are becoming a bit trickier. The biggest obstacle is the duplication of events and infinite loops. Because different bots can trigger each other in the ways that we don't want them to do, what we want to do is to mark down all the possible scenarios and cases where it can happen so we can prevent this. If we want to achieve a perfect two-way synchronicity between Notion and Google Calendar events, we need to consider all the possible edge cases that can lead to unwanted or unnecessary triggering of our bots. For example, our bot number 1 will trigger when we add a new Google Calendar event and create a new Notion database item. And when the new Notion database item is created, our bot number 3 is triggered and it creates a new Google Calendar event, which in turn can trigger the bot number 1 again, which will create another Notion database record, and it trigger bot number 3 again, so the infinite loop begins. So this will continue to happen infinitely, and new records and events will be created until you reach your account limits for automation runs. So we want to prevent this from happening, and we need to add some extra logic, conditional logic, for our bots. So the first thing we want to do with our bot number 3 is to set up a condition where we want to create new event only if this event doesn't exist yet. In order to do this, we need to set up extra action, which is called filters. For this validation, we will use empty operator, and we will use Google Calendar property. So essentially we say only create a Google Calendar event if there is no existing calendar event linked to this Notion task. Additionally, you may want to add an extra filter to ignore the tasks without any dates. For example, I often add Notion tasks that don't have any particular start date or end date, so that's why I find it very useful. If you do the same and you don't want your bot to run into many errors, I recommend you do the same. So we want to add the filter, select the operator not empty, and to choose end date. So only if the new record has an end date, only then we try to add an event to Google Calendar. There is another thing we need to do to prevent the infinite loop of events. If we take a look at our bot number 1, we add a Notion database item every time the Google event is created. But really we don't need the Notion records to be created every time. We only want the Notion records for the events that are not yet in our database. So we need to add an extra step to prevent this. We want to use the search item by property action because we want to try to search for Notion record with the ID of Google Calendar event ID. So we want to select our database and use the event ID to put it in the Google Calendar ID. And if this record was found, we want to add another filter. So we continue only if it doesn't exist. So if it was not found, if found equals no, only then we will go to the next action. By implementing this step, we basically say if the new Google Calendar event is added, only add it to Notion if it doesn't exist yet. Now we want to save and activate both bots number 1 and bots number 3. Now we can go to Notion and create an event. We want to set up end date and time, let's say for 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. and press I'm done. Here is the event from Notion that we created, and it contains the Notion task ID, and in Notion it contains the Google Calendar ID, so they are again perfectly synced. So what we did here is that we created a Google Calendar event from the Notion record, updated the Notion record with Google Calendar ID, so we linked it together, and we prevented this from creating duplicate events and running into infinite loops. If we take a look at our bot's activity, we can see that bot number 1 was trying to add another Google Calendar event, but since it was already created, it was stopped by this filter that we implemented. If there was no this filter condition, new records would be created infinitely. Now we want to see how events created from Notion can be edited in Google Calendar and still be synced both in Notion and Google Calendar. So we'll take this event we created in Notion and put it in another day. Sometimes it can take up to 1-2 minutes to get synced, but now we can see that the event we changed in Google Calendar synced to our Notion as well. Now we can see that the changes made to Google Calendar events are synchronized regardless whether we created the events in Google Calendar in the first place or in Notion. Lastly, we want to create our bot number 4, the final piece of a puzzle that will update our Google Calendar events once the Notion record is updated. For this, we'll need to create another bot with a trigger for when the Notion database item was updated. We'll call this bot number 4, and sometimes it can really take a long time to load your databases. Next, we want to set up an action, which in our case will be update Google Calendar event. Again, select the calendar. Event ID we want to use from the property of our Notion records. So this means that we will update a Google Calendar event that is linked to our Notion record, and we again have to put all the fields into Google Calendar event. So the task name in the summary, the page ID in the description, and the start date and end date to start time and end time, because if we leave it empty, then the Google Calendar will also leave it empty for some reason. So we only want to do this if there is an actual event associated with our database, Notion database record. Otherwise it will try to update non-existing event and will run into error. So we'll add an extra filter step in between, and we will use not empty operator and property of Google Calendar ID. So if the Google Calendar ID is not empty, if there is an event linked, only then we will update it. Save it. In order to prevent an infinite loop when updating Google Calendar and Notion events, we need to make another change to our bot number 2. We need to make sure that our Notion database is modified only when there is an actual change in the Google Calendar event, and in order to do this we will use the end date and time of the Google Calendar event. We will insert another filter in between our two actions. So how are we gonna check if there was an actual change in the event? We want to compare if there is a difference between the date and time from Google Calendar event and the existing Notion record. For this we will use not equal date operator and compare event ends property and event end date property from Notion, and basically if there is a difference between them, only then we will update Notion database item. This check will put a stop to any potential infinite loop and will make sure that the Notion database item is updated only if there is change in the Google Calendar event. Save it, activate it, bot number 2, bot number 4. Now we will try to move the event from Notion to another day, say to Saturday, and see how it reflects in Google Calendar. And now we see that the event moved from Thursday to Saturday and saved all its properties and stayed synced with our Notion database. Implementing all these steps will let you have your Google Calendar and Notion tasks database perfectly linked. It is worth mentioning that it's possible to further upgrade and scale this. For example, if you want to use some extra properties to your tasks or use multiple calendars, it's possible to do. There are a few downsides to this setup. The first is usage of Google Calendar descriptions. Since our description field in Google Calendar is used to store the Notion record ID, we cannot use it for any other purposes. The second downside is the time zone when displaying time inside Notion tasks. If we go take a look at our Notion, the time zone settings you set in your automate.io bots are not dynamic. So the date inside Notion tasks will be displayed in the single time zone you set in automate.io. The good thing that in Google Calendar it still displays nicely. This setup will work if you're using a single Google Calendar account. If you're using multiple Google Calendar accounts, for example for work, you will need to make certain adjustments to the bots to make it run smoothly. But it's possible. If you'd like to hear more about it, just let me know and I can share my setup for that one as well. If you like this video, give me a heads up in comments. I actively use Notion for more than 2 years, and there is plenty of other stuff I can record videos about. Thank you for watching and take care.